Earlier today, the Cato Institute held a discussion on the 114th Congress and Libertarian policy priorities. Scholars analyzed tax reform, the housing market, and pending trade agreements. This is an hour.
So good afternoon, everybody. I am Peter Russo. I am the Director of Congressional Affairs for the Cato Institute. So thank you all for coming today to hear Cato's third annual Libertarian State of the Union. In his January State of the Union address, President Obama laid out plans for his final two years in office. His remarks frequently remind me of the Groucho Marx line that politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. Well, we've heard plenty of that over the last few years and unfortunately seen it in action too. So where does that leave us? What does the agenda mean for liberty? How will it affect economic growth? With Republican majorities in the House and Senate, what can policymakers do to address pressing issues while still working to reduce the size, scope, and intrusiveness of government? To discuss the current state of the union with respect to financial regulation, tax policy, international trade, and intelligence surveillance, I have with me today 4 Cato policy experts. To my left is Mark Calabria, Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. Before joining Cato in 2009, he spent 6 years as a member of the senior professional staff of the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. In that position, Calabria handled issues related to housing, mortgage finance, economics, banking, and insurance for Ranking Member Richard Shelby of Alabama. He's built a career evaluating the impacts of legislative and regulatory proposals on financial and real estate markets, with particular emphasis on how policy changes in Washington affect low and moderate income households. He holds a doctorate in economics from George Mason University. Chris Edwards is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at Cato and editor of downsizinggovernment.org. He is a top expert on federal and state tax and budget issues. Before joining Cato, Edwards was a senior economist on the Congressional Joint Economic Committee, a manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and an economist with the Tax Foundation. He has testified to Congress on fiscal issues many times, and his articles on tax and budget policies have appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other major newspapers. He is the author of Downsizing the Federal Government and co-author of Global Tax Revolution. Edwards holds a BA and MA in economics, and he was a member of the Fiscal Future Commission of the National Academy of Sciences. Senior fellow Julian Sanchez studies issues at the busy intersection of technology, privacy, and civil liberties, with a particular focus on national security and intelligence surveillance. Before joining Cato, Sanchez served as the Washington editor for the technology news site Ars Technica, where he covered surveillance, intellectual property, and telecom policy. He has also worked as a writer for The Economist's Democracy in America blog and as an editor for Reason magazine, where he remains a contributing editor. Sanchez has written on privacy and technology for a wide array of national publications, ranging from the National Review to The Nation, and is a founding editor of the policy blog Just Security. He studied philosophy and political science at New York University. Finally, Dan Eikenson is director of Cato's Herbert A. Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies, where he coordinates and conducts research on all manners of international trade and investment policy. He's authored dozens of papers on various aspects of the subject, focusing his research on U.S.-China trade relations, bilateral and multilateral trade agreements and institutions, globalization, U.S. manufacturing and trade remedies, such as the anti-dumping regime, even co-authoring a book entitled Anti-Dumping Exposed: The Devilish Details of Unfair Trade Law. He has testified before a variety of congressional committees on various policy matters and is a frequent guest on numerous television and news programs. His articles have been published in nationally circulated newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, Forbes, and National Review. Eikenson holds an MA in economics from George Washington University. Well, these are our scholars. Each will speak in turn for 7 to 10 minutes or so, and after which we'll open it up for Q&A. So let's please welcome Mark Calabria.
Thank you, Peter. It's an honor to be with my distinguished colleagues today, and I thank the audience for showing up. I know it must be tempting to be here rather than playing outside in what's got to be a lovely, 17 degrees after wind chill factor, so at least it's warm in here. Of course, the State of the Union has to deal with partly where are we today as a country, and I want to start a little bit with where are we today as an economy. And of course, Politicians are often made or broken by the state of the economy, and of course the economy directly impacts all of us, whether it's weak or strong, impacts our own job prospects, impacts the job prospects of our friends and neighbors. Don't need to remind you that we are entering the 6th year of recovery since the economy bottomed out in 2009. There are some bright spots, but I think it's fair to say that the economy disappoints in a lot of ways. And yes, we've seen consumer spending in the second half of 2014 pick up. Consumer confidence has picked up. But to me, an area of tremendous concern, despite today's employment numbers, continues to be the labor market. We've had the unemployment rate finally drop last year to below 6%. Unfortunately, a considerable percentage of this decline in the unemployment rate was workers leaving the labor force. So declining unemployment for the wrong reason. Labor participation rates have steadily been falling since 2006. While these January numbers marked a small uptick, that uptick was only large enough to offset the decline we saw in December. So we're still relatively flat. And to kind of put that in perspective, had the labor participation rates today remained at 2006 levels, our economy would have another 10 million jobs. Certainly no trivial number. It was only in September of 2014 that we reached the number of jobs we had in 2007's peak. So it took us 7 years simply to get back to where we were, and of course that does not account for population growth. So I think the bottom line in our labor market would be it's falling far short of where we'd like it to be. And I think it's also fair to say it's falling short of where previous recessions have seen in terms of recoveries. I'm also certainly the first to say this morning's job report certainly was a positive in terms of the headline. One of the things that concerns me in that job report, however, is the 2 percentage point increase in teen unemployment since December. And given that a number of states increased their minimum wage starting in January, there's certainly some potential that this is a factor we're starting to see play out in the labor market. Again, too early to really tell, but certainly something that I think needs to be watched. Related to the weak labor market, of course, is a weakness in housing construction. We did break 1 million starts last year, and that was an important threshold, but I'll certainly say by way of comparison, at the peak of the housing market in 2006, we were twice as many at 2 million starts. So we still have a long way to go, and obviously that impacts employment and construction and related industries. So, to summarize in sort of our economy before I move on more to policy, I think we're slowly headed in the right direction. There are lots of weaknesses that remain. I would certainly say I don't think we're anywhere near the time where anybody should be taking a victory lap on the economy. There's also an extent to which I think it's easy to say that perhaps job market weakness is because of a lack of demand. Obviously, there can always be demand as a sort of more demand as a definitional sense. But to me, one of the more important policy and economic questions has been a disconnect between our labor markets and overall spending and jobs. Quite simply, GDP, consumer spending for years continued to increase, even if slowly, where the labor market was essentially flat. And again, this has only changed in recent years. My own view, and I think this topic continues to be debated, is that the expansion of means-tested programs, particularly in the form of mortgage forbearance, created very strong disincentives to work, at least at prevailing wages. I think the recovery in housing prices and the contraction of the safety net are one of the major forces behind the labor market starting to recover. So despite, or perhaps because of this rebound in housing prices, homeownership rates have continued to decline. They recently hit numbers that we haven't seen since the 1990s. In fact, our homeownership rate today is not far from where it was in 1960. A lot of areas I work on a daily basis in mortgage finance, and one would think that since we've gotten back to homeownership rates that we have literally not seen in decades, perhaps that would call for a rethinking of our U.S. mortgage finance policies. Unfortunately, I don't believe such is in the cards. Just recent weeks, the President announced a lowering of premiums in the Federal Housing Administration program with the goal of bringing more marginal borrowers into the market. We also saw the regulator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac decide that despite their current condition, that the time is now right for these entities to take on more risk. And when I mean their current condition, I mean lack of any capital. The taxpayer is directly on the hook for any losses that these entities might take. So just like previous attempts to expand homeownership to households that could not sustain it ended in tears, I fear this effort will as well. And while the reduction in FHA's premiums are intended to improve the credit quality of FHA's loans, I think the emphasis on marginal borrowers, which again are younger and have positive correlation with low credit, is going to suggest to us that instead what we're going to see is a reduction in credit quality among FHA. To me, that's quite a feat given that about 2/3 of FHA are already subprime borrowers. Hard to imagine the credit quality of that book getting any worse. So I think this is going to end up costing the taxpayer considerably, both in terms of reduced premium income, which of course will make the appropriators have a little tougher job making the numbers work, but it's their problem, not mine, or I guess the president's problem. And of course that will mean we'll have further losses by bringing more lower quality borrowers in. It's also worth remembering, FHA is a particular case of this, but as I'm going to talk in just a little bit in a minute, it's not the only program on our budget where the costs are pushed out in further years and have estimated credit subsidies. So to give you some sense of the concern, the estimates for the last 20 years for FHA have underestimated the actual cost of the program by over $70 billion. So these are costs that are not collected in the premiums of the program. These are costs where the programs don't pay for themselves. And quite frankly, this is an amount that has to be made up by the taxpayer. We've seen similar costs, a little bit less in the student loan programs. But so I would say be weary of government loan programs that promise lots of profits, because more often than not, those profits are illusionary. So let me talk a little bit what I would call shadow budget obligations. My colleague Chris Edwards, our budget expert, will talk more about what's actually on budget. I want to talk about what's not on budget, but really ultimately eventually comes onto the budget. And that's the sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit subsidies in our financial system. In terms of direct loans and guarantees, these shadow liabilities are over $3 trillion. Largest amount of that is, of course, the housing at about $2 trillion. And again, this is stuff that's directly part of the budget, but the cost not reflected, like FHA, VA, rural housing, and such. Student loans are another $1 trillion. Again, these programs end up costing significantly more than they're ever promised. And while those are on budget, they're not accurately reflected. Worse of concern to me is those implied guarantees that aren't even on the budget. So, for instance, the taxpayer, I think, is correctly perceived to be standing behind the $6 trillion in debt of Fannie and Freddie. You will not find that reflected anywhere on the cost of the budget. It's also worth saying there's probably about $2 trillion in private pension funds that are at risk that the taxpayer may be asked to pick up as well. So again, it's important to keep in mind lots of figures, lots of contingent liabilities. I would go as far to say of equal concern is given the actions, the widespread bailouts during the financial crisis, and the structure of the Dodd-Frank Act, in my opinion, leaves the taxpayer potentially standing behind trillions in bank liabilities as well. Obviously, the taxpayer stands ultimately behind the $7 trillion in insured deposits in our bank system. The question is whether the other $6 trillion or so in uninsured bank liabilities, whether the taxpayer is going to be on the hook for any of those as well. And of course, that says nothing of when you guarantee risk. Again, it's Econ 101. You make the cost of something lower, people will consume more of it. The same is true about risk in our financial system. So most of these guarantees, whether they're student loan guarantees, whether they're mortgage guarantees, whether they're banking guarantees, encourage excessive risk-taking in our marketplace. And I think that's something we need to be greatly concerned about, even if the financial crisis starts to fade into the memory. To give you some sense of these unfunded liabilities, first I'll start with one of my former colleagues at Cato has estimated that our unfunded liabilities in net present value terms are about $70 trillion of what promises we've made we can't keep. By way of comparison, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond has estimated that these shadow liabilities in our financial system are as much as $25 trillion. So one quickly gets close to almost $100 trillion in potential liabilities. To put that in context, that's almost 8 times GDP. Clearly, we don't have the ability to pay that, and we won't. So I certainly would say by difference, however, some of these financial liabilities do have collateral behind them. Certainly Fannie, Freddie, FHA all have mortgages somewhere where there's physical property. So to attempt to summarize the state of what I would call our financial fiscal union, it's at best shaky. I think the health of our banks and housing markets have been driven by an immense flood of Federal Reserve liquidity. Unfortunately, much of that liquidity has gotten stuck in the banking system and not made it to the greater economy. So this has been good for banks. It hasn't necessarily been good for the overall economy. If and when the Fed starts to raise rates lower the next later this year, I think there's a significant chance that housing prices will flatten, may eventually actually decline in the coming years. So I guess I remember when I was on the Hill and everybody chanted that housing prices never go down. Don't let it be said now that you haven't heard that, yes, housing prices actually do decline. And when they do, nasty things happen. So, of course, you need to keep that in mind. In several markets, such as those along the coast like San Francisco, my own view is that a housing price decline is probably a good thing. Incomes there are far short of what one would need to afford a house. But while this might be a needed adjustment, it will nevertheless be a painful adjustment. Despite weak private lending, banks have had a run of profitable years driven by essentially free money from the Fed. To the extent that this backdoor assistance has helped build bank balance sheets, higher rates may well increase private lending. I think that's something we'll have to wait and see. But to the extent that it has just papered over fundamental flaws in our financial system, I very much worry that another financial crisis may be well in the works. So the bottom line is to ensure the sustainability of our current recovery. I think deep structural reform is needed in our financial regulatory system, particularly but not exclusively in the area of mortgage finance. And again, while we are 6 years past the financial crisis, my opinion is that the fundamental drivers of the crisis remain to really be addressed. So maybe with that very happy note, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Chris Edwards, who I know will be even more cheerful.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. I'm Chris Edwards, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and also editor of downsizinggovernment.org, our website that tells you how to cut the federal budget. Well, President Obama has introduced his 2016 budget, and I'll be talking about the taxing and spending in the budget. The language of the budget is rather triumphant, as if the administration has solved all our economic and debt problems. And his budget policies are rather aggressive. In particular, his tax policies are a bit of a poke in the eye to American businesses and to Republicans who just happened to win a landslide election last fall. So this was not a compromised budget on taxing and spending policy. So to look at spending policy first, under President Obama, spending and debt has soared. Federal debt as a share of GDP has roughly doubled since 2008. Federal debt is actually the highest it has ever been in our peacetime history. And the president's budget sort of seems untroubled by that and would keep debt at very high levels. The president proposes budget deficits of around $500 billion a year for the next decade. And again, the administration sort of seems untroubled by that. But that is $500 trillion of new costs every single year that will be passed on to younger Americans. The administration in its budget proposed no plan to ward off fiscal doom from rising costs in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which will be growing as a share of the economy. The trust fund for Social Security disability insurance runs dry next year, and the administration just papers over that problem. The Congressional Budget Office projects that federal spending will grow to around 30% of the economy by 2035. So future Americans will be increasingly less free as the government gobbles a greater share of everything produced in the nation. But that sort of scary forecast by the CBO and OMB has similar long-term projections. They're actually optimistic for several reasons. First, President Obama, for example, in his budget shows discretionary spending, meaning defense and non-defense spending, dropping pretty remarkably as a share of the economy over the next decade. Now, I would be greatly in favor of that, but the problem is the president has actually no plan to make that happen, no major cuts and terminations. So his showing falling discretionary spending is really smoke and mirrors to cover up the size of the deficit problem. A second issue is that the United States may face unforeseen major wars in the future. Iraq and Afghanistan cost us $2 trillion, an enormous amount of money. So hopefully we will avoid major wars. But the problem is if we do get into major wars, we're going to be starting from a high level of debt. President Bush started his wars when we had a low level of debt. So if we have major wars in the future, they could be catastrophic fiscally as we go higher and higher into debt. A third issue is that in these long-term projections of OMB and CBO that look scary enough, they do not include recessions. We may well have major recessions in the future, which will blow huge holes in our deficit in our federal budget. So now that the economy is growing, it would be prudent to start paying down debt, but unfortunately, President Obama's budget does the opposite. So in sum, the official projections are artificially rosy, and I think the upshot is that policymakers should be scouring the federal budget, looking for programs to cut and terminate, especially now that the economy is growing. Now would be a great time to cut federal spending. As I mentioned, the Cato's website, downsizinggovernment.org, is a great place to go to look for programs to cut. One area that I think Congress should cut are subsidies to state and local governments for things like education and housing and transportation. These federal subsidies for state governments cost over $600 billion a year. They are ripe for cutting. A good opportunity, I think, comes in May when the Federal Highway Trust Fund runs out of money. The Highway Trust Fund has a large gap between spending and gas tax revenues. Congress should cut spending down to the level of gas tax revenues to solve these problems and allow the state governments to fill the gap however they want. President Obama's budget goes in the opposite direction. It raises taxes to increase highway and transit spending. That is the wrong way to go, I think. There is no advantage in increasing federal intervention in the nation's highway system. State governments can raise their own money to spend on their own highways anytime they want. They don't have to wait for the federal government. So switching over to President Obama's tax proposals, there are two problems with them. They would increase tax complexity, and they are very much anti-growth. It's a curious thing that Obama's budget says repeatedly that his tax proposals would simplify the tax code. President Obama repeatedly in speeches and in his State of the Union says he wants to simplify the tax code. But if you look at the details of his proposals, they would actually complexify the tax code in many different ways. He would tax capital gains at death. He would impose a new bank tax. He would impose a new so-called Warren Buffett tax on high earners. And he proposes many complicated new tax credits. There's a $500 tax credit for two-earner families. And there's a variety of sort of business giveaway tax credits, such as a new manufacturing communities tax credit. These would all complexify the tax code, which is the wrong direction to go. His tax proposals are also anti-growth. President Obama would increase the federal capital gains tax rate from 24 to 28%. If you add state taxes on top, our capital gains tax rate would be 32%. It's remarkable. If you look around the world at our trading partners in the OECD countries, the average capital gains tax rate is just 18%. So we would be up at 32%. The average OECD country would only be at 18% in terms of their capital gains tax rate. Why do other countries have low capital gains tax rates? Because they know that low capital gains tax rates are good for entrepreneurship and good for investment in startup and growth companies. President Obama's capital gains tax rate increase, unfortunately, is very much anti-Silicon Valley. President Obama would impose tax on capital gains at death. The problem with that is we already have a 40% estate tax that hits wealth at death. Again, if you look around the world, countries generally either they have estate or inheritance taxes or they tax capital gains at death. They generally don't do both. Obama wants to do both. And the problem is that will induce high earners to save and invest less, which ultimately hurts the economy and hurts all of us. President Obama would increase corporate taxes. The United States has the most uncompetitive corporate tax system in the world. We have the highest rate with state taxes on top. The U.S. corporate tax rate is 40%. The average global corporate tax rate is just 24%. A second problem with our tax system is that we tax corporations on a worldwide basis. The United States sort of claims the right to tax U.S. companies on their operations throughout the entire planet, which when you think about it is kind of a bizarre way to set up a tax code. Just about every other OECD country has what's called a territorial tax system, meaning that they do not tax the foreign operations of their multinational companies generally. So the problem with Obama's expansion in the taxation of U.S. multinationals' foreign operations is it would make the United States an even worse place to headquarter a multinational corporation. We've seen this development of inversions in recent years. That is caused because the United States is a bad place to headquarter multinational corporations. Obama wants to put a new 19% tax on the foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies. Most other countries put a tax rate of 0 on the foreign subsidiaries of their companies. It's a weird thing that Obama and his administration seem to view the foreign operations of U.S. companies as sort of an enemy to be punished. But actually, foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies are complementary to U.S. production. The better that foreign subsidiaries do in general, the better it is for U.S. production and U.S. workers. So when General Electric is successful in its foreign subsidiaries, that is generally good for GE workers here in the United States. So to sum up on the tax side, Obama's budget goes in the opposite direction, I'm afraid, of real tax reform. Tax reform to this administration seems to mean only penalizing high earners and American businesses. So unfortunately then, I think we're going to have to wait for the next president to get real tax reform that simplifies the code and is good for the economy. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. So in that other State of the Union speech, I was at least initially heartened to hear President Obama say that while others had moved beyond the debate about our intelligence agency surveillance programs, he had not. My enthusiasm waned a bit when he made clear that what he meant by that was that he would be issuing a report about things they had done internally to add additional safeguards on those programs. And that report, which was released earlier this week, I think mostly underscores how far short they've fallen in reform efforts, not just from what several independent panels have recommended, but from indeed what the president himself committed to just over a year ago. I think what we see in that report is by far not enough, both from a civil liberties perspective, because we have constructed a truly unprecedented and sprawling architecture of data collection on the premise that effective intelligence now requires extraordinarily broad and, in some cases, entirely indiscriminate collection of data about the guilty and the innocent alike, an architecture that, because of its breadth, could, in a time of crisis or at the behest of people with poor motives, be, I think, with the flip of a switch, turned from legitimate to illegitimate purposes in the way we have seen in our history repeatedly over decades under intelligence services with inadequate oversight, although they lacked anything like the capabilities of the modern NSA and FBI. But it's also inadequate, I think, for economic reasons. We see increasingly distrust in global markets of American technology companies. We've seen projections that the American cloud computing sector alone stands to lose something on the order of $180 billion over a period of 3 or 4 years because of that declining trust, especially in the enterprise sector. We've seen precipitous declines in, for example, global orders for Cisco's routers, following reports about how NSA was installing malware on those, not just for particular individuals, but at the corporate level. And so both to restore public confidence in our ability to protect civil liberties and global market confidence in the trustworthiness of American technology firms, we need to do quite a bit more. So, of course, at the end of the last session, we saw the main surveillance reform vehicle, the USA Freedom Act, stall in the Senate. The, I guess, most prominent component of that was reforms to Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act, as well as some related authorities to get telecommunications metadata. This is most famously, of course, the basis for the bulk telephony metadata program revealed by Edward Snowden. The president, more than a year ago, committed to end that in its current form, end the bulk collection by government of telephony metadata, although that continues and was recently renewed yet again. several independent bodies, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, as well as the President's hand-picked bipartisan surveillance review group, have both said this is a program of extremely limited effectiveness that could safely be ended and should be ended. The PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, even went into some detail examining claims about the efficacy of this program, supposed success stories, terror plots that had been foiled, and went through one at a time, demonstrating how in 11 out of 12 of those cases, in fact, the program, contrary to the claims made on its behalf, had provided no unique intelligence of use to FBI or NSA. And in the 12th case involving material support, meaning monetary donations to the Somalian group Al-Shabaab, had been in fact, causally, the first way they found some useful information, but that it was not necessary, that targeted methods would have sufficed. We have had the agreement of the intelligence community that with the reform approach that was outlined in that legislation, they can duplicate the essential functionality of that program, even though, again, it seems to be of limited effectiveness. We've seen the General Counsel for the Director of National Intelligence, Bob Litt, at a conference we held at Cato, and then again this week at the Brookings Institute, saying the intelligence community was comfortable with this reform, that it was something that preserved all the capabilities they required, that indeed they wished it had passed, and yet we hear frankly, somewhat confusing invocations of things like the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the rise of ISIS, invoked as reasons that, again, despite what the intelligence community says, we need to preserve a domestic call records program. I think there is such a thing as being more Catholic than the Pope. If the intelligence community and every expert body says these are reforms that we can undertake that will improve privacy and civil liberties protections without hampering the intelligence mission, that there should not be the resistance we see. Similarly, we've not seen any significant reforms to collection under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. This is an authority essentially allowing general warrants that permit NSA analysts to select foreign-based targets, but of course also allowing their communications with Americans. And we know that, at least in the last count, there were over 90,000 such targets under one order, one sort of quasi-warrant tasked. And of course, again, many American communications are swept up in the process. This is particularly concerning given that we know that the FBI is authorized to search these databases for the identifiers of Americans. So people, of course, it would not be legal to collect on directly because they're citizens or in the United States without a particularized judicial warrant, can then be pulled out of this enormous pool of global communications they've collected from an enormous number of targets who, as former NSA Director Hayden recently stressed, are not necessarily bad guys. Because NSA doesn't just look at bad guys, it looks at people who are saying things that are interesting. And indeed, the FBI can do this, can search this database for American communications, even when they're conducting mere assessments, meaning not a full predicated investigation based on some kind of actual evidence of wrongdoing, but just to satisfy themselves that there is not wrongdoing being committed. It's also concerning because of a practice we learned about called so-called about collection. That is to say, a target is selected and accounts or phone numbers are selected. This is typically most concerning with respect to internet communication, so an email address or online account is tasked for collection, but the collection does not just encompass communications to or from that address. Rather, all international internet communications are scanned, the contents of those communications scanned, and communications neither to nor from the target, and perhaps to or from Americans, are collected if they contain a reference to a target identifier. Again, this recent report has proposed a number of additional internal approvals for the use of some of these techniques. But as I think Justice Scalia said memorably in a recent Supreme Court opinion, our founders did not fight and die for stricter internal protocols. By the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court's own standard, in fact, this these techniques would appear to be unconstitutional. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court has articulated an exception from the traditional warrant requirement for electronic searches. Suggests that when a search is conducted both for a foreign intelligence purpose and when it targets someone believed at the probable cause level of certainty to be an agent of a foreign power, there is a foreign intelligence special needs exception from the usual requirement to get a particularized judicial warrant. And yet, of course, that is not a requirement of this type of collection. It requires that collection target foreign persons, but does not have that additional requirement. So you have communications of U.S. persons who are protected by the Fourth Amendment collected under conditions that don't satisfy the FISC's own criteria for a foreign intelligence exception. That should be a problem, I think. We've also heard calls increasingly, even as we are hearing dire warnings about the state of American cybersecurity, to restrict encryption technology, both in terms of communication services, platforms that are used by people that may provide encryption, and device encryption on things like smartphones. These are extraordinarily problematic, first, I think, because very little evidence has been presented that, in fact, this is proving an insuperable obstacle to any concrete investigations. The information in the enormous universe of data we now swim in can't be obtained in alternative ways. But it's problematic as a matter of principle, because the presumption is effectively that the government can require you to store your own information in a format designed to facilitate their access, though you have been committed of no crime. It's as though they said you had to write your diary in English to make it easier in case the government ever wanted to read it. It's problematic from a security perspective, because security experts are near unanimous. It is just wickedly difficult to create any kind of communications technology or system that is both secure against unauthorized assault, but will work against its own user to provide access to only those entities that you wish to grant access to. It's problematic from an economic perspective, because, of course, on the global marketplace, trying to sell devices and technologies that are announced to have a deliberate architecture for security breach built into them is a difficult proposition. And slightly more subtly, it's problematic because it entails maybe non-obvious design constraints. That is to say, when you mandate that either a device manufacturer or a communications provider retain the capability to provide unencrypted communications, you actually bake into that mandate a bunch of other design constraints that, again, may not be obvious to the non-technical, but for instance, you push people from distributed and peer-to-peer communications architectures, which are hard to intercept, toward centralized communications architectures, even if there are good technical reasons not to want to implement that architecture. Finally, I think the unifying problem that brings all of these things together is the extraordinary lack of transparency. A lot of the surveillance programs I've talked about were implemented subject to secret rulings by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, secret interpretations of statutes by government lawyers, often wildly differing from what any ordinary member of the public would have understood the law to be authorizing, and certainly indeed even what many prominent legislators understood themselves to have authorized. Any reform to be credible, I think, with the public in any of these areas is going to need to be bundled with reform requiring some minimal level of transparency in major decisions from the FISA court. In a democracy, we believe that there is no such thing as secret law, let alone a kind of body of secret common law. We may not ever know as much about the state of our union as the FBI and the NSA do, but we should at the very least know what the state of the law is. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. I'm going to speak to you about something that's a little less scary than what Julian just described, but important nonetheless. I think I'm comfortable saying that the state of U.S. trade policy is probably closer to the libertarian model or the libertarian ideal than just about any other public policy. And that's not because the government's not encroaching in trade policy or that because it's particularly libertarian. It's that government encroaches a lot more in these other spheres of our public lives. So we're still a long way from the libertarian ideal in trade policy, and that ideal would be free trade. The free flow of goods and services across border, without tariffs, without quantitative restrictions, without discriminatory regulations, the free flow of investment across borders and in and out of the country into any industry, any and all industries, the free flow of labor in and out of the country. So the moral case, I think, for free trade is pretty compelling, and people are entitled to the fruits of their labor. They're entitled to dispose of their property as they wish. The government interfering in those decisions, trying to tilt the balance by, say, subsidizing domestic producers so that their products are cheaper, or taxing foreign producers so their products are more expensive. That's where the unfairness is, and it messes up incentives. It compels people to make political decisions instead of economic ones, instead of investing in R&D or in production facilities, making a better mousetrap. Companies are more inclined to invest in politics and on K Street. Even companies that don't want anything to do with Washington end up having to spend money in Washington because their competitors are here asking for things and demanding things. So it creates this problem, and it ends up distorting markets because producers don't know what to produce. They don't know how to satisfy consumer demands. So I'll get off that high horse. All right, I'll talk more about the mission of the Trade Center at Cato. Our goal is to educate the public and policymakers about the benefits of free trade and the cost of protectionism. Our goal is not to achieve free trade. If that were our goal, I would have lost my job a long time ago. So where do we stand with respect to that goal of illuminating people about the benefits of free trade? Well, let's ask this question. Is the public more aware of the benefits of trade and the cost of protectionism now than they were last year, or 5 years ago, or 20 years ago? I think the evidence is mixed. You look at poll results, and you see an American public that is sort of grudgingly accepting of the idea that the United States needs to be engaged in the global economy. But you also see reticence, reluctance, skepticism about the impact of trade on jobs in particular. Let's look at the political dialogue. Well, the political dialogue is still fairly partisan. Republicans tend to favor trade liberalization and freer trade, representing business interests. It's not necessarily free trade, but it's pro-trade, pro-export. Democrats tend to be guided by their labor and environmental and anti-corporate interests, or opposed to trade. But interestingly, I would say more so than at any time in the 14 years I've been at Cato, prospects for trade liberalization right now are greater than really at any time in that span. And that's fairly ironic, considering the president who is presiding over this state of affairs is a president who has really never even made a case for trade liberalization. He's never made an affirmative case. During the State of the Union a few weeks ago, he made a defensive case. We have to engage in these trade deals because if not, we're going to be left behind, and China's going to write all the rules. So it's really, it's something that we have to do rather than something that is beneficial that we should do. And to me, that's sort of the wrong way to pitch trade. Let me digress for 1 minute and give you 150 years of trade policy history in that 1 minute. Democrats weren't always the party of protectionism and Republicans the party of free trade. It was the other way around. From the Civil War until about 1934, Democrats were the party of free trade. Republicans were the party of protection. The tariff is the mother of the trust. Big business interests didn't want competition, so they liked it. They liked tariffs. Between 1934 and approximately the NAFTA vote in the early 90s, trade was pushed on a bipartisan basis. There was a bipartisan consensus that trade was a good thing. After NAFTA, Democrats started really peeling off and opposing trade. And when G.W. Bush was president, it was at the beginning of it, at least, it seemed unlikely that the trade agenda was going to go anywhere. There was a lot of internal combustion going on here in the United States. But after 9/11, there was a new sort of impetus for globalization to show solidarity, and there was a majority. The Republicans controlled Congress, the Senate, and the House. And in seeking trade promotion authority, President Bush didn't want to incorporate or the Republicans in Congress didn't want to incorporate some of the demands of the Democrats, which were demands for labor and environmental provisions in trade agreements. So Trade Promotion Authority passed on a very partisan basis, and all of the subsequent trade agreements during the early 2000s were fairly partisan. The vote was fairly partisan. When Obama became, I'm sorry, when the Democrats took control of Congress in 2007, there were 3 pending bilateral agreements negotiated in the Bush administration with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, which were taken off track by Nancy Pelosi. It wasn't given fast track treatment, and that climate prevailed. So when President Obama assumed office, he basically capitulated to that climate. He didn't attempt to push these trade agreements at all. And so for several years, these agreements lay fallow. And in 2010, when the Republicans took back the House, starting in 2011, President Obama decided, okay, I'm going to help get these agreements through. And he did. He worked with Congress to get these agreements done. He announced that we're ramping up efforts in what's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. He set his USTR off to negotiate the deal. But still, he never made the case for why we should be doing this. And then we had the 2012 election, and his rhetoric, again, was very defensive on trade and somewhat anti-trade. Last year, finally, Trade Promotion Authority legislation was introduced on a bipartisan basis, but Harry Reid said, don't even think about bringing this to the floor. We're not going to vote on it. And they didn't. So right now, we're at the stage where we are trying to negotiate, or trying to get Trade Promotion Authority for the president. There's language being written now in Senate Finance and House Ways and Means. Likely by the end of the month, something is going to come out. I generally think Trade Promotion Authority is a good idea. Under the Constitution, Congress has the authority to regulate foreign commerce. The president has the authority to enter into foreign treaties. Trade Promotion Authority is an expedient. It's a compact. Congress is making its objectives known. You must do X, Y, and Z. You can't do A, B, and C. If you bring back an agreement that meets these objectives, we will vote yea or nay with no chance of amendments, no filibusters. Trade Promotion Authority is described by its opponents, though, as sort of an executive power grab. Congress is just capitulating. It's just giving away its responsibility to the president. That's really not the case. So I think it would be good for the president to have Trade Promotion Authority, because otherwise you can't get an agreement. Foreign negotiators are not going to put their best offers on the table unless they know the deal that they negotiate is going to be able to withstand congressional scrutiny. In other words, it won't be picked apart by Congress. So there's a lot of opposition to the trade agenda itself, meaning the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation. And then there's also the transatlantic negotiation that's going on, the TTIP. I'm not sure that I'm going to support the TPP or the TTIP. I think I'm inclined to do that because I think it makes us more economically free. But these trade agreements have a lot of protectionism baked into them. Trade agreements are not free trade. They have some industries that are entirely carved out from liberalization. Some tariffs are phased out over long periods. For example, the auto industry there's a 2.5% import tariff on automobiles. The auto industry wants to phase that out over 25 years. So like 0.1% per year. There are also provisions for more rigid intellectual property provisions. You know, intellectual property is a monopoly. Do we need some? Maybe. Do we need more than we have under U.S. law? Probably not. But some of these agreements are pushing for that. They're pushing for investor rights, for foreign investors to be able to go outside of the U.S. judicial system if there has been expropriation or they've been treated unfairly and their asset values have declined. Likewise, U.S. companies would have access to this third-party tribunal system as well. I don't think it's necessary. But I will evaluate these agreements by whether or not they are net liberalizing. And I think those who want to nip trade in the bud by denying fast track or trade promotion authority have it wrong. Get trade promotion authority, and then Congress can still vote no if they don't like it. The other issue that I want to bring to your attention is the Export-Import Bank. That was supposed to lapse last year in September. It was reauthorized temporarily through June 30th. The Export-Import Bank is an export credit agency which allegedly finances export sales that private sector banks would be unwilling to touch. if that is the case, if that's what it does, they're putting taxpayer resources at risk. Defenders of the bank say that they're making money for the Treasury. There's really no risk. That's like driving home drunk and then rationalizing the next day. I made it home safely last night. I can do it again tomorrow. Taxpayer dollars are at risk. But also, and this has not been a big part of the debate, and I'm trying to get it into the debate, there are costs. Americans love exports, right? Exports are good, imports are bad. The trade account is our scoreboard. We're losing at trade because we have a deficit, and we're losing because everybody's cheating, so we love exports, right? That's the wrong way, of course, to think about trade. But because people think exports are so good, the Ex-Im Bank thinks that, we underwrite exports, so we're good, reauthorize our charter. But there are costs. There are costs to other companies in the same industry that don't get Ex-Im subsidies. They're put at a disadvantage. There are costs to downstream industries. The best example is Delta. Delta has been raising the roof about subsidies to Boeing. Ex-Im's primary customer is Boeing. But when Boeing's customers like Air India or Air Ethiopia get subsidies from U.S. taxpayers are subsidizing the competition of U.S. carriers. And Delta has made a big deal about it. But think about it. There's $50 billion of subsidies that went out over the past 7 years in manufacturing. Each of these manufacturing beneficiaries has a downstream customer. And these customers are put at a disadvantage the same way Delta is. So I'm hoping that the bank is not reauthorized. Its life is through June 30th. And that's something that we're standing for. We wrote about it in one of the papers out there, Cato's suggestions for the 114th Congress. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, we do have time for some Q&A. There's really only one rule, and that is to express your question in the form of a question. But otherwise, we're ready to go. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Sharon Bobat, Voice of a Moderate. I have a question to follow up on the Import-Export Bank. I've talked to progressives, and they believe that they want the bank reauthorized because of green technology. Then I've talked to the Hawks. They want it reauthorized because they think the Republicans are going to change it so weapons can be included as one of their things that they will insure. And if that happens, we'll be selling a lot more weapons. And then people at the DOD tell me they don't want that because we have vets that are going over to Afghanistan with one limb because they need people, and we don't have enough money for the VA to take care of the people that we need to take care of. So my question is, your statement about the export-import just made me happy because finally somebody just says that other companies are hurting by doing this. So the issue that I have is, how does it get explained to the general public so it's clear, because I don't think Congress really gets it.
Thank you. Excellent question. I wrote a paper about those downstream costs a few months ago. Been distributed up here, but I've been told that people are having a hard time understanding it. So I'm going to try to revise it a little bit and make it more accessible. What I find to be the most interesting twist in this whole Ex-Im debate is the support that Ex-Im's reauthorization is getting from progressives. They've spilled tons of ink and shouted from the rooftops about corporate welfare, and all of a sudden they're supporting it. And the only reason that I can imagine they're supporting it is because the proponents of getting rid of the bank come from the right, the Tea Party. And, if the Tea Party stands for it, we must be against it. So I think that motivates a lot of opposition, or lots of support for Ex-Im's reauthorization among progressives.
Thank you.
You sir in the back.
Yeah, my name is Hermes. I just have a question about, we are already now out of recession, but do you think that another crisis is possible? Can you identify any indicators that will show that maybe we're not totally out of recession?
Is this for Mark?
Sure. I'm reminded of an economic forecaster friend of mine who likes to say, give a number, give a date, but never give both. So I'm going to try to in that mind frame, say, I'm absolutely 99.9% sure we will have another financial crisis someday. Boy, I wish I knew when that was going to be, because maybe I could short it all and make some money, but I don't know when it's going to be. So certainly there are several sectors of the economy I'm worried about. I guess I should roll back and say, as a general rule of thumb, when you have long stretches of time when the real post-inflation rate of interest is negative, that is, you're essentially paying people to take money. I'm certain if you pay vast parts of the public to take money, somebody's going to do something dumb with it. So we've had 6 years where the Fed has run a negative real interest rate policy. That to me has distorted property markets, it's distorted the equity market, it's distorted the bond market. So when we see that unravel, again, it's a question of when. I'll say, for instance, I thought the housing market was going to peak in 2004, so I was off by a year and a half. Again, can't say when I think it's going to be, but I do think within the next 5 years we're going to start to see property markets, equity markets level off, go down in some areas. There are still there are some positives. I do think the banks are undercapitalized, but better capitalized than they were. I think the amount of risk in the mortgage market is still pretty big, but not as bad as it was. So then again, there are other areas. I don't think the sovereign debt crisis in Europe is anywhere near being solved, so that's a very big overhang. But again, I don't think we've dealt with the fundamentals. And I'll end that just by simply saying you rarely get a financial crisis without some sort of expansion in asset prices and expansion of credit. And we've seen both of that in this case. And again, whether the companies have made better decisions this time around, I guess, remains to be seen.
Yeah, I would add to that. Recessions happen. Economists haven't figured them out. Whether they are called business cycles or whatever you want to call them, they are complicated, and economists simply cannot foresee when they're going to happen. If you go back to January 2008, when the CBO introduced its budget projections, it did not see the recession that had already started in December of 2007. In January 2008, CBO saw a rosy future of actually rising growth, 2%, 3%. Economists have no idea how to project future economic growth. Their forecasting record is terrible. It's because we don't totally understand how the economy works. So we will have another recession. I don't know what it's going to be caused by, whether it's going to be caused by central bank screw-ups or changes in energy markets or whatever. But to me, the upshot is that we ought to be prudent with the federal budget. We ought to get deficits and debt down now while we have a chance. The economy is growing now. Now is a good time to start making some of these reforms we need to make, because again, what if we get into a deep recession? What if we have another major costly war? It's going to put the country in a terrible situation because we're going to be starting off from a very high level of debt. So we ought to be prudent. Policymakers ought to be prudent. I don't see much of that on either side of the aisle in Washington.
Yes, you, sir.
This is directed at Mark Calabria, but anybody else who has anything to add can more than welcome to add. But I'm wondering about your talk about all these contingent liabilities that the U.S. government has, and of course it's increasing its deficit every year and doesn't seem to care. And for a lot of reasons, the federal government seems to be have the markings of a subprime borrower, and the reason why they can continue to do this is people keep on lending them money. Now, this is all based on psychology, and because they think that because other people are going to, the investor class thinks that because other investors are going to keep on lending the government money, that's fine, so that they can lend them money. It keeps on going on, but this strikes me as a kind of a weak psychology. Now, I know that other competitive currencies are in just as bad shape as the dollar.
Can you move to the question?
Now, so the question is do you envision any situation where the investor class will stop lending money to the U.S. government at such low interest rates?
So let me first say, I do think a lot of the fundamentals are worrying, but the point you raise about psychology is very valid, and the thing that concerns me about that, and I think we've learned this repeatedly, is that the psychology of these situations can change quite quickly. All of a sudden, great confidence, and we all know that despite the fact that Greece has repeatedly defaulted, they'll pay us this time. Oh, well, maybe they won't. And again, that's only one example. We certainly are in a situation where, because so much of our financial system, and again, we saw this play out in Europe, but so much of our financial system is built on things like Fannie Freddie debt, Treasury debt, that if there's any problem in that sector, then the financial system itself is going to crater. So I do think that there's a deep concern there. I don't think we've really addressed it in any way. I will note, I think some of the attraction of these off-budget sheet liabilities are just it's so much easier for politicians to spend money that way. It never shows up on the budget. You make promises that you don't have to pay for. Of course, many of the rules, for instance, the accounting rules, many of these programs I mentioned, as I talked about FHA in my discussion, the premiums in FHA don't even cover the administrative costs. So the salaries for 3,000 some employees aren't even reflected in the premiums they charge. So I guess I'd end with saying the problem is that the government engages in a lot of what I would call is Enron-style accounting. It hides its liabilities off the balance sheet. And when they come back on the balance sheet, like it did for Enron and did with Citibank, it's not pretty.
We have time for one more quick question. Yes, Jesus.
I don't know how quick this is, but my part will be quick. Any hope for a freer flow of labor from this? I didn't really hear anything on immigration from any of you guys, and that's one I would hope to see some movement on over the next couple of years.
Dan, do you want to?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
It's immigration.
Hope for a freer flow of labor.
Oh, do I think the prospects are good?
Yeah.
Not really. I refer you to the work of Alex Narasta at Cato. He's written quite a lot about this stuff. The Republicans are not all that willing to embrace the idea, but it's something that we need to continue to push for.
Maybe I'll end on a more optimistic note, and again I'll emphasize Alex Narasta at Cato has written a tremendous amount on immigration. I really direct people to his work, but I do think this is a slow turn where many Republicans are starting to see that even from a pure political calculus that being sort of anti-immigrant doesn't necessarily work. So again, I'm not optimistic in the short run, but I am optimistic in the long run. And I think the fact that most of us recognize that our parents or grandparents are immigrants and contributed to this country is a message that resonates with most people. So I'll end with saying, as an economist, I do think that part of this reflects the labor market at any one time. And since the labor market is getting better and people get more secure in their own jobs, I think they get less concerned about competition for their jobs.
And there you have it. Let's thank them all one more time. Before you go, on the table on your way out, there is our new policy priorities for the 114th Congress. There's essays in here from everyone on the panel, including Alex Narasta. So I encourage you to take one on your way out. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Robert, how are you? Arizona State University.